Hello everybody, it's Mrs. Ware of Stream English here, and I'm going to start today by talking about the actual question itself and what does it look like. You can see here 4 different examples, 2 from the power and conflict cluster and 2 from the love and relationships cluster. And I'm going to look at how basically the question stem is the same regardless of what question you're dealing with. The first important thing to note that is in common across all of these questions is the fact that they always give you one poem and then they expect you to choose the second poem. That's important to note because for the poem that they give you that you have to talk about, they print that poem in the exam for you. So you've got the entire poem there to be able to quote. The poem that you choose, however, you have to know off the top of your head because they do not print that in the exam. Now, AQA have said that they don't expect you to memorize the whole poem. They don't even expect you to memorize quotes per se. They just expect you to be able to refer to the second poem. And that is good to know if you're sat in the exam and your brain goes blank on the exact wording, because you know that you can rely on your direct quotation analysis from the one that's printed in front of you. And for the one that you can't really remember the exact line of, you can paraphrase, you can give the idea. However, that is a kind of last resort for if you have forgotten in the exam. In reality, you need to have memorized some quotations that you can actually directly then quote in the exam. The reason for that is because close analysis is such an important part of this exam that you can't really afford to not ever have close analysis of the other poem, even if it's just one quote. And that's why for the quotes that you memorize for the other poem, first of all, I don't recommend memorizing quotes from all 15 of your cluster. That'd be way too many poems. Instead, I recommend you pick a combination of 6 core poems. What I mean by the 6 core poems are they are the ones that you will choose from when you're faced with this comparison. You will choose from one of these 6 to compare with. You still know the other 6, you've still revised them and studied them so that if they come up in the exam, you're ready. You just haven't memorized quotes from the other 6 because you know that you've got that already printed in the exam. So memorize quotes from just 6 of them. In terms of which quotes you go through the effort to memorize, I have a few recommendations. Number 1, key metaphors. You absolutely want to be memorizing key metaphors in the poem. Number 2, any key structural device, for example, a volta or any really important repetition. You also, I recommend, want to memorize the privileged position, so the first and last lines of the poem. They tend to be really, really important because they're about establishing key ideas in the first line, and then it's that, what kind of tone, what kind of message does the poem end on in the last line. So basically, you're memorizing key metaphorical language, and that would be down to you to choose what's key, but I recommend having more than one key metaphor memorized, especially if we're dealing with a poem of multiple themes. For example, I'm thinking, Storm on the Island, a metaphor for the power of nature, but also the power of man, that kind of thing. So your metaphors, your key structural devices, repetition, volta, that kind of thing, if there's particularly effective use of enjambment or rhyme scheme or something like that. And then your privileged positions, first, last lines as well. With that in mind then, you've got your poem that's printed in the exam and the other poem that you've chosen, and you've got the quotes to memorize. What you have to do across all of these is always the same with that as well. You have to compare them, okay? You have to compare them in particular on the ideas in the poem. Now, it's worth noting that for the different clusters, the themes that you look at are always going to be pretty similar. So for the power and conflict cluster, spoiler alert, the themes are always going to be in some way about power and about conflict. The exact form that takes can vary slightly. So, for example, you can get one like that top Ozymandias example, where it's just very vague and left very, very open. How do they present ideas about power? And it's your job to narrow that down. Power in what way? On the other hand, you can also get questions that are much more specific. So again, you can see with the second power and conflict question, how people are affected by difficult experiences. In other words, the effect of conflict. But you can see there you've been given something much more specific and direct to look at. The same is true of the example love and relationship cluster questions. Family relationships, so yes, it's relationships, but a specific kind of relationship, and romantic love. Yes, love, but a specific kind of love. So they will always be in some way to do with power and conflict or love and relationships, but they might just narrow down for you exactly what about power or what about love and relationships it is that they want you to talk about. The next thing I want us to look at is the mark scheme. Now, the mark scheme has 3 assessment objectives, AO1, AO2, and AO3. What do they mean? Well, AO1 is your argument. That is basically your answer to the question. AO2 is your analysis, and AO3 is your context. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is that at the very kind of top of the mark scheme, AQA kind of break down the 30 marks that this question is worth as a whole. They break it down into AO1 and AO2 being worth 12 each, and then AO3 being worth 6. Now, examiners don't mark it like that. Examiners don't give you a score for AO1, a score for AO2, a score for AO3, and then add them together. Your teachers might have done that for your essays in the past, but they have done that as a marking strategy in order to help you identify, across the 3 assessment objectives where your strengths and weaknesses are. In the actual exam, the examiner is just going to look at the essay as a whole. They're going to take into account all 3 and then place you in the level that best reflects where you are at with all 3. However, AQA have provided that little number breakdown in order to convey a really important message to the examiner, and that is that argument and analysis are far more important than context. Argument and analysis are essentially what are going to decide your mark, and context will perhaps be part of refining your mark within a particular band. And that's important for you to keep in mind as well, in the sense that you need to be making sure you're getting that argument and analysis really right. However, I don't want you to interpret that to mean that you can forget about context. They're still saying it's important. It still gets its own level in the mark scheme. You still want to make sure that you've got it in there too. So I've provided here the last 4 levels of the mark scheme, level 6 to level 3. The reason I've done that is because this basically reflects your grade 5 to grade 9 spread. The grade 5 tends to happen around the pass mark, so around 15 out of 30, the top of level 3. Your grade 7 tends to happen at the very top of the level 4, so 20 out of 30. Your grade 8 and 9 are then both within level 5. So grade 8 typically falls around 22, 23 out of 30, and the grade 9 typically falls at 25 out of 30. So your level 6 is basically just a strong grade 9 overall. The reason that's important for us to note is because basically we want to make sure we understand how to move between 2 key brackets. How we can move from level 3 to level 4, how can we get ourselves from not passing to passing, but then also how can we get ourselves from level 4 to level 5, how can we get ourselves from getting a grade 5 or a grade 6 to getting the grade 7, 8, possibly even 9 if we're going for that very high top level there. So that's what I want to start with talking about, is how can we move ourselves between these different levels. And I'm going to do that by taking each assessment objective one by one and talking through how you climb through those levels for that assessment objective. Starting with AO1 then. It's worded at level 6 as critical exploratory comparison, level 5 thoughtful developed comparison, level 4 clear comparison, level 3 some explained comparison. Now, the key thing to note there is that it's all about comparison. You need to compare in your argument. The worst thing you can do is just look at the first poem and then look at the second poem and never mention any ways that are similar or different. If we're thinking about that level 3 to level 4, what that basically means, because you've got some explained comparison, it means you perhaps mentioned once how the poems are similar or different, but you never really engaged with it. You never really said much more than that. You just mentioned something once. If you are level 4, then you are clearly comparing, and you are looking at how they're similar in numerous different ways or how they're different in numerous different ways. If you've moved into the level 5 thoughtful, developed, the difference between that and level 4 essentially comes down to the quality of the argument itself. Do you just say the same thing from start to finish, or do you build on what you said at the beginning to kind of add something new? The top strategy I recommend for you being able to do that is the both however structure. The both however structure means that you are going to look at how the poems are similar, both, but also how the poems are different, however. The reason that's going to help you get the thoughtful developed is because you're not just looking at the poems on a very kind of one note of they're similar, they're similar, they're similar, they're similar. You're exploring the nuance, you're much more exploring the complexity by saying, yes, they're similar like this, but they're also different like this. So the both however structure is really going to help you with that. It's also worth noting that the difference between level 4 and level 5 is going to come down to what you compare as well. So if you are aiming for the kind of grade 4 to 6, what you'll find is you've gotten there by comparing the plot of the poems. So you're saying things like, in both of these poems, there are soldiers who have gone to war. You're comparing the plot. If you're looking at the grade 7 to 9, then you'll find that what you're comparing is the theme. Both of these poems explore the effect of war on your mental health. So if you're going for the level 5 and the level 6, the comparative argument that you make has to be focused on the ideas in the poem and how those ideas are similar and different. If you've ended up in the grade 4 to grade 6, one of those reasons is possibly because you've looked at plot instead. You have said in both of these poems, the speakers are grieving for somebody that died. That's not thematic, that's looking at the actual events of the poem itself. All of that then has to be followed by analysis. Now, as I mentioned before, AQA have said the argument and analysis are on the same level. I would actually argue the analysis is a little bit higher, and I'll explain what I mean by that. You can have a grade 9 argument, but if you never analyze, it can't really be a grade 9 argument. Because if we look at that description of a grade 9 argument of being critical and exploratory, how on earth are you supposed to have done that without ever providing quotes and breaking down how meaning is created? Conversely, you might have an argument that's perhaps clear. It's a level 4 clear comparison. But then your analysis is so good, it's so thorough, it's so exploratory, it's so detailed, that is what pushes your actual argument as well into being thoughtful and developed, because your analysis was thoughtful and developed and therefore developed your argument as well. So even though the two are equally weighted in terms of the mark scheme, in terms of your thinking about what you're doing, you really need to make sure that you're not forgetting about analysis, that you're not forgetting that it needs to be there, it needs to be detailed, it needs to be thorough, it needs to be high quality. If you feel like you're good at analysis, you know how to analyze in Inspectacles, you know how to analyze Macbeth, you know how to analyze for language paper 1 question 2, then you're going to be able to do the same here because the skill is identical across all the different questions. If you feel like analysis is a weak area for you, then it's something you need to pay attention to here, because again, it's the same skill across all the questions. So if it's your weak area for an Inspectacles, it's probably going to be your weak area here too. I'm not going to go through analysis in this video because it's a kind of skill in its own right that's kind of separate from any specific question, but I do have a lot of videos on how to analyze loads of different things, specific techniques, specific poems, all that kind of stuff. So make sure you have a look at my other videos if you feel like you want some kind of help and support with the analysis side of things. But the important thing I want you to note for right now is that, as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure you're analyzing a range of different techniques, language, structure, and form, and you want to make sure that that analysis is constant throughout your entire essay. There is not a single argument that you make that is not matched with analysis of the same kind of quality, ideally. AO3 for context. It's worth noting here, a lot of students think that, I have no idea what to say about context. What can I possibly say about this poem? I don't really know any context. And that sometimes leads to students saying things that don't really feel relevant. You know, like I've seen comments about how in Poppies, the poet likes knitting and therefore there's imagery to do with sewing in the poem, which is true, but that's not really particularly perhaps relevant to the question, and nor is it in any way developing an argument. And that essentially is what the issue is between level 3, level 4 and level 5. It's how important is that context in actually serving your argument. You can see that at level 3, it says some understanding of implicit ideas. That suggests that what you've said isn't completely accurate, or that you've been very, very vague and unclear or something like that, and therefore your attempt at using analysis hasn't really worked. At level 4, you do have a clear understanding of the context, so you clearly have referred to some context, but it's not really developing your argument in any way. Level 5, it is developing your argument. It's worth noting that the difference between level 5 and 6 in this mark scheme for all 3 of the assessment objectives is that level 6 is essentially that you did level 5 for the whole essay. You did it pretty much for the entire thing. That's what level 6 is. So even though they've used all this other language, it's essentially that you've been able to keep level 5 going rather than you just managed to hit level 5 like at one point in your essay and nowhere else. The rest of it was level 4. If you've managed to basically have a level 5 across the entire thing, you're going to be putting yourself into level 6 overall. But going back to the context point, so what does that mean then that if you're developing your argument? Well, we can think of it with kind of 3 keywords: what, how, and why. So your what is the poet saying about the theme? Okay, so if the question is power, what is the poem saying about power? The analysis is your how. How does the poet convey that idea about that theme? So how does the poet show nature is powerful or something like that? What techniques are they using? And you break down how those techniques create that effect. Your context is your why. Why is the poet suggesting nature is all powerful? Now, this means often looking at context of production. So you could look at things that influence the poets. So some kind of classic ones is you're dealing with a lot of romantic poets in, for example, the power and conflict cluster. You might be dealing with poets who were inspired by real life relationships. You might be dealing with poets that are writing based on real historical events, things like that. So you can talk about those things that influence them and use that to explain why they presented a theme in a particular way. But actually, not every single poem has something like that you can really talk about. But what all of the poems have got is that their poet has messages and ideas that they are trying to get across, and that is also context. So if you are talking about what Duffy is trying to highlight, or what Lewis is trying to emphasize, or what Tennyson is trying to criticize, then you are talking about essentially context, because you're coming back to the poet and what their intentions were, what they were trying to say to their audience. That counts as context. So if you haven't got that information, that kind of historical information of things that influence them, just talk about what are their ideas, what's their message to the reader, what do they want us to take away from their poem. Use the poet's name, keep talking about their message, their intention, their ideas, and you're going to be hitting that contextual point there. And again, to make sure that it's that level 5 thoughtful consideration and not level 4 clear understanding, every reference to context is not just kind of shoved in there as a fun fact, like, hey, Lord Tennyson was the poet laureate. It's used to deepen your argument. So Lord Tennyson was the poet laureate, and that is perhaps therefore why he has presented the soldiers as brave in the face of death, because he is trying to create a sense of patriotism and celebration of British soldiers in England or something like that. So you want to make sure that your reference to context is developing your argument, it's not just shoved in there as a fun fact. With that in mind, you can see that the link between, there is a close link between that 7 to 9 of looking at theme in your argument and then also looking at the poet's messages and ideas. Because if you're looking at the poet's messages and ideas, then you're essentially also looking at theme there as well. The poet's message, Duffy's message, is not, here is a war photographer. Duffy's message is about the power of photography, the apathy of people outside of conflict and all that kind of stuff. So getting that right of really looking at the poet's message and ideas, if you can also match that up with an argument that's heavily looking at theme, then you are really on your way to the right thing. So from what I've said so far, you can see that number one, analysis, argument, incredibly important, but that doesn't mean you can forget about context. You still need to think about how you can explore what the poets are trying to say. The main difference between level 3 and level 4 is that in level 3, you're not really doing it. You're not really doing what the question is looking for. You're not really comparing. You're not really analyzing. You've not really understood context, and you're not really referring to it. Whereas level 4, you are doing all those things. You're ticking all those boxes. You are comparing. You are starting to analyze. You do show a clear understanding of the context. The level 4 to 5 difference I have touched on in the sense of it being that difference between being thoughtful versus being clear, but I really want to just stress now what I mean by that, so that we're really clear, because that's obviously a really important jump we'd like to make of going from grade 5 and 6 to grade 7 to 9. So I'm just going to stress now what it is you've got to do to kind of jump that gap between level 4 and level 5. To explain that, I'm going to talk about cake, which, bear with me, is relevant, I promise. So I want you to imagine, first of all, you've got two cakes, okay? You've got a chocolate cake, 5-layered chocolate cake, but it's all chocolate, the exact same cake all the way down. You've also got a cake that is 5 layers, and it's 5 different flavors as well. So you've got your chocolate in there, you've got your raspberry in there, you've got vanilla in there. I can't think of 2 more kinds of cake. You get the idea. You can let me know in the comments some 2 more kind of cake flavors I should have thought of that are probably really obvious, but my mind is blanking right now. Point is, you've got one cake, every flavor is the same. A second cake, every layer is a different flavor. Now, you might be thinking, oh yeah, I'd much rather have the cake that is entirely chocolate. But in this analogy, we don't want that cake, okay? We don't want the cake where every layer is the exact same flavor. We want the cake where every layer is a different flavor, which I appreciate in reality is probably not going to work and probably going to taste horrible because of how all the flavors clash. But bear with me here. This analogy is going to work, and it is going to help us understand essays. If we think about how these cakes compare to essays, our chocolate cake, our pure chocolate cake, is your level 4 clear essay. Because essentially what the student has done is they've put forward an argument, and then everything they've said has just like repeated that exact same argument. There's nothing new, there's nothing developed. For example, they have said, in bayonet charge, the speaker experiences an internal conflict. They then do this. Here's some analysis that shows the internal conflict. This is reinforced by some more analysis which shows the internal conflict. Additionally, here is how I know there is an internal conflict. In conclusion, there is an internal conflict. They're just saying the same thing over and over again. Now, they have proved that idea. They've absolutely shown that there is an internal conflict in bayonet charge, but they haven't really taken it anywhere else. They've just kind of repeated the same thing. If we take our other cake of all the different layers, the difference there is that we're dealing with a student who has started off by saying in bayonet charge there is an internal conflict, and then with each new thing that they've said, they've developed, they've built on that initial idea, so that by the end of the essay we've got a lot more going on. So for example, they start off in bayonet charge there is an internal conflict. They develop it. This conflict is between the purpose for the soldier's self versus the purpose in the war and for society at large. So like survival versus patriotism, you know, the king and all that kind of stuff. We then look at the result of that internal conflict and the result of that internal conflict and what it does to that person's mental and physical health. And then finally, we look at, does the poem suggest one side wins? And yes, it absolutely does. It is the side of survival that wins the internal conflict. So we're still always looking at internal conflict, but every single time we've kind of had a new idea, we've developed it further so that by the end of the essay, we've got one cake with a lot of different flavors within it. And that works on an analytical level and on an argument level. So each of your topic sentences, if you write T paragraphs, points, if you write P paragraphs, each of your topic sentences is developing what came before, but also within your T or your P paragraphs, your analysis is doing the same as well. So when you look at language and structural analysis and form, or you look at 3 different kinds of language analysis, you don't just reach the same conclusion every single time. There is internal conflict, there is internal conflict, there is internal conflict. Each time you're like, this metaphor shows the internal conflict, which is reinforced by this sympathetic background, which suggests that this internal conflict is all-consuming, which is reinforced by this consistent stanza length, which suggests that the internal conflict is ongoing and has been with the soldier for a long time. Like, every single piece of new analysis that you do is still on the same topic, but is developing what you said before rather than just repeating what you've already said. So that is the difference between you grade 7 to 9 with our cake of many flavors versus you grade 5 to 6, our cake of one flavor. You want to be the cake of many flavors, even if in reality, a chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, raspberry, coffee, banana cake would taste vile. In essay land, it is, perfect. Chef's kiss, delicious. On now to how you structure your answer. Now, you don't have to follow my way of structuring the answer. You can do it a different way. There's no like set rules here on how you do it, but this is the structure that I would recommend because I think that it helps you push yourself into that like level 6, level 5, 6 area of argument and analysis as well. And context as well. So to start off with, you'll start off with having a both, however introduction, and I'm going to talk through how you write one of those. So in your introduction, your opening paragraph, you'll look at how the poems are similar, but also how they are different. You will then have a paragraph where you look at that similarity idea in the first poem, and you'll then do the same in the second poem. You'll then look at your however idea of how the poems are different in one poem, and then in the second poem, and then you'll have a conclusion. So by following this structure, you are making sure that you are constantly comparing throughout your entire essay. You're making sure that you're exploratory by looking at both poems equally and looking at a range of different things in your poems. And by following the T paragraph structure, which I've got a separate video on if you feel like you want to get an insight into how I write T paragraphs, or if you've already been taught how to do it, P paragraphs. By following the T paragraph structure, you're going to make sure that you are analyzing the context, analyzing the language, analyzing the structure, and so on and so forth. So by following this structure, you are going to help yourself with ticking all of the AO1, AO2, and AO3 boxes. With the introduction, the both however introduction, I'm going to show you a kind of scaffold, if you will, a way of writing the introduction. You don't have to follow my exact wording by any stretch, but by including all of these different elements, you're going to be helping yourself make your introduction as strong as possible. So this is what my structure looks like. Both poem A and poem B explore question keyword. As the poets suggest, argument. However, the poems also differ on this theme, as poem or a poet suggests argument, poem B or poet, on the other hand, suggests argument. This difference is perhaps linked to their differing contexts, contextual argument. Now, I just want to explain what it is that I'm doing here. So with the both, however, the first thing in that very, very first sentence, we are making sure that we are clearly answering the question by using the question keyword. And we are in our argument stating how the poems are similar. In what way are they similar based on that question keyword? So by question keyword, I mean, are we talking about family relationships, romantic love, power, the effect of conflict, power of memory, whatever it is the questions ask you to write about. And poem A and poem B, you're obviously just talking about the poem they've made you write about and the one you chose. Doesn't matter what order you write the names of the poems in. In your second sentence, you're then starting to establish how the poems are different on that same topic. So you're saying for one of the poems what the argument is, and then you're saying for the other poem what the argument is. So you're establishing the differences that they've got as well. And then you end by trying to link back to the context. So remember, this could be a link back to historical ideas, or it could just be a link back to the poet's key messages and ideas as well. Depends on what you think is best choice, and it's going to really help you develop your argument in this essay. I want to show you now what this looks like in actual practice. So I've taken one of those practice questions from the Power and Conflict cluster. Compare how poets present ideas about power in Ozymandias and in one other poem. And here is the introduction that I wrote based on that. Both Ozymandias and My Last Duchess explore the abuse of power, as the poets suggest that the abuse of power comes from domination over others. However, the poems also differ on this theme, as Shelley emphasises that this power is ultimately transient. Browning, on the other hand, explores how the abuse of power is able to perpetuate. This difference is perhaps linked to their differing contexts. Shelley, as a supporter of the French Revolution, sought to condemn monarchical power. Conversely, Browning was inspired by a true story and so sought to reflect the reality of that story. So you can see here, I followed that structure I just showed you in order to clearly identify how the poems are similar, how they are different, and how that difference between them is perhaps a result of the different things that inspired our poets, the different messages that our poets have. So this is a really great thing to help you make sure that you're going to really cover that thoughtful, developed argument from the very beginning, and then also that you get your context in there early on as well. It will also really help you in terms of just being an introduction overall, in that it will help you make sure you know what it is you're trying to say in your essay. It's important to note, however, that once you commit to that in your introduction, that is what you need to talk about in your essay. I've said I'm going to talk about the abuse of power. I can't suddenly start talking about the power of time or something else that's in these different poems. If I've said I'm going to talk about abuse of power, then I have to talk about abuse of power because that's what I've committed to in my introduction. So part of what they're testing you on for that AO1 is your ability to establish, this is what I'm going to say, and then you actually say that in the main body in your essay. You actually see your argument through to the end. So this introduction would be considered a very strong answer. This would be, obviously I can't grade it just off of the introduction, but the potential in that introduction, there is the potential for 4 marks if the rest of the essay took it in the right direction. I want to talk to you now about T paragraphs. Now, as I said, I'm not going to do a massive detailed thing about T paragraphs. You have to have a look at my other videos for that. But one thing I do want to establish is that your topic sentence, the point to your paragraph, needs to always be comparative. If it's in the both section, then you're going to be looking to compare how the two poems are similar. If it's for the however section, then you're going to be looking to contrast how the poems are different. Now, to do that, you want to have a group of transition words that can help you. So under comparison, you want to be using words like in the same way, likewise, similarly, just as, blah, 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 so too, blah, blah, blah. So looking at ways that the poems are similar. Similarly, with contrast, you want to have your transition words in the bank that you can use, like conversely, however, unlike, in contrast. It's worth noting that you don't just want to use these words in your topic sentence. You need to have them in your topic sentence. They have to be there. You need to be clearly comparing in your topic sentence. But that doesn't mean that that's the only place you have them. I would recommend having it in your analysis as well. Specifically, whenever you're looking at the second poem of the two. So let's say you've written your paragraph about poem 1, analysing, I don't know, the power of nature, and you're now writing the power of nature in poem 2. When you reach your analysis for poem 2, let's say you've just finished analysing a metaphor, there's nothing to stop you being like, oh, that was just like poem 1 earlier because of this reason and this reason. Or you can be like, oh, in this poem, the power of nature is like this, but in that poem, the power of nature is like that. So the comparative language can be part of your analysis as well. And I would recommend making it part of your analysis of whenever you spot that pattern of oh, this poem was different in this way, or this poem was similar in that way. Just put it in your analysis as well. But as a minimum, it has to be in all of your topic sentences. So you've got comparison in your introduction, all of your topic sentences, and then you'll have comparison in your conclusion as well. On to that conclusion, a lot of students feel like they don't really know what a conclusion is and how to write one. I'll be honest and say it's probably the least important part of your essay. If you don't manage to write a conclusion, that's not going to stop you from getting a grade 9 because everything else you've written could have possibly gotten you to that point. However, I will say the conclusions can be a really nice bow on the kind of wrapped present. They can really tie everything together and just really cement the high grade of your essay, because again, it's a chance to come back to that comparison and really focusing on how they're similar and different, and give you that chance to be critical, exploratory, and so on and so forth. So if time allows, I always recommend a conclusion. If time doesn't allow, don't stress over it. You can still get a really great score based on the rest of the essay that you've written. For the conclusion, I again have a structure that I recommend, and that is this. Ultimately, Poet A seeks to criticize or highlight or teach or warn or reveal the importance of or celebrate your argument. This is similar to Poet B in that argument. It is also distinct from Poem B because argument. So what you can see is that in the conclusion, I'm essentially completely focused on the poet's messages. So it's almost like entirely context. So again, really nice if you feel like you've not done enough about context in the main body of your essay, a conclusion like this can really help you with getting that context mark in there. Because what you can see is that it's in that first sentence about examining what Poet A, so Armitage, Duffy, Tennyson, whoever, what are they trying to achieve? Okay, what are they trying to do with their poem? Are they trying to criticize something, teach something, celebrate something, reveal the importance of? You don't have to pick from within these verbs. I've provided these as a kind of starting point, but whatever verb you think comes to mind works. The point is you're looking at, in that first poem, what is the poet trying to achieve? What's their message? You then say how that's similar to the message from Poet B. So you explore how they have a similar message. You then, however, finish with a sentence looking at how that is also different, how the intentions behind them, the poet's intentions in the two poems, are not identical. There is a difference between them as well. To show you what that looks like in reality, I'll come back again to that same question about power in Ozymandias, and I've again got this example for you here. Ultimately, Shelley seeks to highlight the transience of all human power when compared to that of nature. This is similar to Browning in that My Last Duchess highlights the transience of female power in the face of male dominance. It is also distinct from Ozymandias because of the message behind it. In the former, the abuses of power will always be brought to an end. In the latter, that the abuse of power is strengthened and continues thanks to money and status. So I've really established what the messages are that's similar between the two poems, and also what the messages are that are different. You can see here that it's still on the same ideas that my introduction established about abuses of power, but I have since developed. I would have written main paragraphs that developed it. So with My Last Duchess, the development is how it's about female power versus male dominance. When in Ozymandias, it's about human power compared to nature and how abuse of power can't survive against nature. So I do develop from my introduction. I haven't just repeated myself. I've looked at, you know, what's the new cake flavor I have added since the start of my essay, and that is then summarized here. So again, this conclusion, it would depend on what I'd written beforehand, but this is looking like that kind of like full mark potential conclusion, assuming it comes at the end of a full mark grade 9 essay in which I would have successfully proven all of this. I'm sure I would have done. Last thing I want to talk about today is what do you need? So to be able to do everything that I've said in this video, to be able to structure your argument, to be able to analyze, to be able to write about context in all of these high level ways that I have talked about that are going to help you to get the grades 7 to 9, what do you need to know before the exam to be able to do that? So essentially this is almost like a revision checklist, because if you don't know the things that I'm about to go through, it does not matter that you've seen this video, you're not going to do very well because you don't have the knowledge. I, in this video, have talked about the skill of how to write an essay to a really high standard, but to be able to write an essay to a really high standard, that has to be underpinned by the knowledge of the texts themselves. So your revision checklist is as follows. You need to know the themes for all 15 of the poems in your cluster. Each poem will fit into multiple different themes. So you want to make sure you've thought about all of the different themes that the poems can fit into. And what is the poem saying about that theme? So what is Sing Song saying on this theme and this theme and this theme and this theme? What is My Last Duchess saying on this theme and this theme and this theme and this theme? Make sure you've revised that thoroughly and you know it for all 15 poems. The next thing you want to make sure you know is the poet's messages and any other relevant context with that as well, if you think there is some kind of relevant context of production to know. So you want to make sure you know what it is the poets are trying to say and how they convey that in their poem. When you know those two things, you can then actually start to pre-plan your comparisons. You can start thinking in advance, okay, if I got a question on the power of memory, what poems would I compare? If I got, well, no, not what poems would I compare, because you only get to choose one. If I got power of memory and I had to talk about poppies, what would I compare to poppies? So you can pre-plan your combinations that you would talk about. Again, making sure that your six core poems that you've gone through the effort of memorizing quotes from, they're kind of able to cover you across all 15 that could potentially come up in the question. So you're really able to pre-plan your comparison. In that sense, you can really go far with that. You can pre-plan, okay, if I got that one and that one on this theme, this is what my argument would be. These are the quotes I would analyze. This is the context I would refer to. Because even though you might not know, you might not get the exact question that you've like pre-planned, you will have got something for it. You will have in some way planned things that could help you out. So that kind of thorough revision of trying to plan as many kind of different potential comparisons as possible, that's going to really help prepare you for the different questions that come up. And then finally, you're going to need to know your memorized quotes and analysis. As I've already mentioned, you're not going to be able to analyze the second poem in any kind of masses of detail if you haven't learn quotes from it. If you haven't got any idea what the poem says, that's going to make you really overly reliant on the poem that's printed in the exam, and you don't want to be in that situation, especially when you consider with the essay structure I recommended, it's, you know, it's 50-50 between the two. So you want to be able to have quotations from that second poem as well. So make sure you've memorized quotes. With that, make sure you've thought about what you would actually say about those quotes. Make sure you know how to write a really high analysis, really high quality analysis of that quotation. Because even though you'll have to kind of adapt it for the argument that you're making, the foundations will often be very, very similar. So it's like I was saying before with the pre-planned comparisons, it's not going to be like you're starting from scratch and you're going to say something completely different about Storm on the Island's Tame Cat Turned Savage if you're talking about the power of nature versus the power of humans versus, you know, the Irish versus the British, whatever it is. It's going to still have a lot in common across the different things. So if you're memorizing a quote, you might as well go through the effort of making sure you know how you're going to analyze it to a really high level too.